What if the United States isn't actually a country anymore? I really want you to just sit with that question for a second.
It is a pretty jarring thought, right?
Yeah.
Because we're so used to our standard definitions.
Exactly. I mean, we are so conditioned to look at a map, see the borders, see the capital city, and just immediately assume we are looking at a traditional nation state, like a sovereign entity that's designed to protect and serve the people living inside those borders.
Right, the classic grade school geography model.
Yeah, but what if, mechanically
Yeah.
speaking, that fundamental architecture has just completely changed? What if you were actually looking at a biological symbiote, like a massive metabolic organism that has hijacked the host body of the nation?
And an organism that now requires a constant, unending consumption of foreign wealth and foreign talent just to stave off its own death.
It completely shatters the lens through which we view almost every geopolitical event of the last 80 years, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, when you look at history through the traditional lens of, nation states interacting, so much of what happens seems completely irrational or contradictory
Hmm.
or just driven by petty ideology.
Right, it looks like chaos.
Exactly. But the moment you swap out that lens and apply this framework of systems biology and thermodynamic physics, the chaos kind of just vanishes. The seemingly irrational behavior of global superpowers suddenly maps to a very rigid, almost chillingly predictable mathematical algorithm.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. So, welcome to the deep dive. The stack of sources we are unpacking today isn't your standard political commentary.
No, definitely not.
There are no partisan talking points here. No moralizing about who is right and who is wrong. Honestly, reading through this research, it felt like I had stumbled onto the source code or like the architectural blueprints of modern civilization itself.
It's very cult, very analytical.
Brutally objective. The authors have adopted this God mode perspective. They treat humanity, global capital, and military power as just raw variables in this massive self-perpetuating equation.
Which, honestly, is the only way to truly understand a macro system. And I really want to set the parameters for you, the listener, right at the outset here.
Yeah, that's important. Let's frame this.
We are not making moral judgments today. We are not taking political sides, whether that's left or right, east or west. Our mission is strictly to analyze global society as a closed ecosystem.
So treating wealth not just as money, but as stored energy.
Right. And treating capital as an autonomous force. We
Right.
aren't here to debate the ethics of the machine. We are here to meticulously reverse engineer its engine and show you exactly how the gears mesh together.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the roadmap for this exploration is massive, and we are going to trace it from the global scale all the way down to the DNA of your own bank account.
It's quite the journey.
We're going to start by dissecting the mechanical anatomy of the American global empire, like how its dual engine actually operates in the physical world.
And then we'll pull back the curtain on biological failsafe.
Right, the thing that has historically prevented humanity from slipping into a permanent oligarchy. And, terrifyingly, we'll examine the legal math the ultra-wealthy are using to hack that failsafe right now.
Which is a whole separate rabbit hole.
It really is. And finally, we are going to completely deconstruct the myth of the benevolent builder. We're going to map the amoral algorithm of modern capital. A system that dictates why building a hospital and strip mining a thriving company are mathematically interchangeable actions.
It is a very dense, unflinching look at reality. But if you want to understand why our geopolitical system feels like it's just vibrating apart at the seams, you have to understand the physics driving the vibration.
So let's start at the macro level, the post-World War II global board. Our source material makes this incredibly provocative claim that the United States transitioned away from being a nation-state decades ago.
Right, it evolved.
Yeah, it evolved into what the text refers to as a metabolic, self-perpetuating system of power extraction, a hegemonic symbiote.
A great term.
So to understand this symbiote, the authors break it down into a two-cylinder engine. Let's get under the hood here. What is the first cylinder?
So the first cylinder is the economic engine, but we really need to define that carefully because we are not talking about GDP or manufacturing output or domestic job creation.
Okay, so not the stuff we usually hear on the news.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are talking specifically about the architecture of the United States dollar as the global reserve currency. This is the absolute cornerstone of the entire global extraction matrix.
We always hear diplomats use that phrase, right? The
Right.
rules-based international order. It sounds so egalitarian, like a global town square where everyone just agrees on the zoning laws.
Yeah, it sounds very polite. But the source strips away that diplomatic veneer completely. It argues that this rules-based allocation of tangible resources is, in purely mechanical terms, a planetary tribute system.
A tribute system, like the Romans.
It operates exactly like the Roman tribute system did, yes, but it is infinitely more sophisticated because it is largely invisible and entirely synthetic.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that invisibility. Because I think people struggle with this. How does a synthetic tribute system actually function in the real world, like day to day?
Okay, let's consider the fundamental requirement for a nation's survival, which is energy, specifically hydrocarbons.
Oil, gas.
Right. So if you are a country like Japan or Germany, you need massive amounts of oil to keep your industrial base functioning. You have to keep the factories running, the homes heated, but you don't produce enough domestically.
So you have to go buy it from someone else.
Exactly. You go to a major producer, let's say Saudi Arabia, to buy it. Now, prior to the mid-20th century, you might trade gold for that oil. Or perhaps you'd trade your own currency if the seller actually found it valuable.
Like Germany hands over Deutschmarks or euros, and Saudi Arabia gives them oil.
Right. But under the architecture of the hegemonic symbiote, that direct transaction is forbidden by the system's design.
Ah, the petrodollar system?
Yeah.
So you can't just hand Saudi Arabia Japanese yen or euros.
Precisely. You must first acquire United States dollars. The entire global commodities, market oil, wheat, copper, lithium, it's all priced and settled almost exclusively in dollars.
So what does that actually mean for the system?
It creates a permanent artificial gravity well. Every single nation on Earth, regardless of its relationship with the United States, is forced to constantly accumulate and hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars.
Yes, to buy the things they need to survive.
Simply to participate in basic biological and industrial survival, yes.
And because they are holding those dollars, they aren't spending them, they are locking them up in central bank vaults, which creates this immense structural demand for pieces of paper that only one government on Earth has the legal authority to print.
This is exactly where the extraction happens. Because the rest of the world is structurally forced to soak up these dollars and just sit on them, the United States is granted an unparalleled mathematical superpower.
The ability to run perpetual trade deficits.
Exactly. Staggering trade deficits without instantly collapsing its currency.
This is a crucial point that I want to make sure we really isolate for a second.
Yeah.
Because a normal country, let's say Argentina or, I don't know, Turkey, if they just printed money out of nowhere to buy foreign goods, their currency would hyperinflate.
Instantly.
Because the global market would reject their paper. They'd say, this isn't backed by anything.
Right. The value of their currency would plummet to reflect the underlying lack of production. But the United States is uniquely exempt from this law of financial gravity.
Because everyone needs the dollar to buy oil.
Exactly. So the U.S. can literally print digital ledger entries out of thin air and use those entries to purchase real, physical, tangible wealth from the rest of the world.
It extracts manufactured electronics from Asia, physical labor from the global south, raw natural resources from Africa.
And in exchange, it hands over a fiat currency that the world is mathematically forced to accept. That is the essence of the planetary tribute. It is the extraction of tangible reality in exchange for synthetic liquidity.
Okay, but if I map this out logically, if I am a foreign sovereign nation, eventually I am going to recognize this friction.
Of course.
I'm going to look at the ledger and realize I am trading my hard-mined lithium, my citizens' sweat and labor, for your digital ones and zeros. At some point, the rational move is to opt out, right? To say, I'm going to sell my oil for gold or for my neighbor's currency.
Which brings us seamlessly to the second cylinder of the symbiote's engine. Because a synthetic extraction system cannot survive purely on trust or diplomatic goodwill.
It needs teeth.
It requires a brutally effective enforcement mechanism. The second cylinder is the military engine.
Now, we all know the U.S. military is powerful, obviously.
Yeah.
But the source frames its primary function differently than just, national defense, doesn't it?
It does. It frames the military as the thermodynamic guarantor of the economic engine.
Thermodynamic guarantor. That's a heavy phrase.
Well, the United States wields hegemonic military force not just to protect its borders from invasion, which is highly unlikely given its geography anyway, but to enforce the unipolar economic order. The military ensures that the global dollar system remains the only viable operating system on the planet.
So the carrier strike groups, the hundreds of global military bases, the command structures in every hemisphere, They are the physical infrastructure that prevents anyone from opting out of the tribute system.
Exactly. They secure the shipping lanes, they protect the flow of raw materials, and crucially, they serve as a lethal deterrent against any nation attempting to establish a competing economic paradigm.
Right.
But the source introduces another incredibly fascinating dimension to the military engine. It doesn't just act as a global enforcer, it acts as a planetary headhunter.
A headhunter. Like executive recruiting, but backed by aircraft carriers. Walk me through how a military recruits talent.
It's an indirect mechanism. By establishing total kinetic dominance, the military engine creates an unmatched zone of stability and extreme wealth concentration at the center of the empire.
In the U.S.
Right. And capital inherently flees chaos and seeks stability. So, because the U.S. mainland is fortified and guaranteed by this military hegemony, global capital floods into American markets.
And where capital pools, opportunity pools?
Precisely. This localized hyper-concentration of wealth, which is generated by the dollar privilege, it creates a massive gravitational pull on human capital.
So we aren't just talking about money anymore.
No, we are talking about neurons, cognitive capacity. The brightest engineers in Mumbai, the top medical researchers in London, the most ambitious software developers in Eastern Europe.
They all look at the global board and realize that to maximize their own potential, they have to migrate to the center of the empire.
Because that's where the funding is, right? That's where the infrastructure is, and that's where the highest compensation is guaranteed.
Wow. So the military secures the dollar generates the wealth, and the wealth acts as a vacuum, just stripping the rest of the planet of its top-tier cognitive talent.
The empire absorbs the apex intellects of the world. It effectively decapitates the competitive potential of rival nations while constantly refreshing its own innovative capacity. It is a brilliant, self-reinforcing loop.
And the authors distill the mechanics of this loop down to 3 absolute axiomatic laws.
Yes. If you want to understand the code, you have to understand these axioms.
Let's take these one by one, because the physics analogies used here are really profound. Axiom 1. Power is thermodynamic. I want to spend a minute here. We usually talk about power as political will or cultural influence. What does it mean to say power is thermodynamic?
It means stripping away the romance of history, honestly, and looking at it strictly through the lens of entropy and energy states.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In physics, thermodynamics dictates that energy naturally flows from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, from disorder to order. Think of it like water flowing downhill. The text applies this directly to the post-World War II landscape.
Right, because if you look at the board in 1945, Europe is completely atomized. The industrial bases of Germany, France, and Britain are essentially rubble. Japan is devastated.
So the global system is in a state of extreme high entropy, total disorder.
Exactly. The global power grid was essentially blown out.
Meanwhile, the United States possessed an entirely intact, highly mobilized industrial base. It was a massive, concentrated node of low entropy order.
So it wasn't just that they were the good guys who won.
No, the flow of global power into the United States wasn't necessarily a brilliant political conspiracy or some moral crusade. It was a thermodynamic inevitability. The vacuum of global organization simply rushed in to fill the highly ordered structure the U.S. provided.
The U.S. created a container, and the fragmented power of the ruined world just poured into it like water finding its level. It's literally physics.
Exactly.
Which leads to Axiom 2, which frankly sounds like something out of a biology textbook describing an apex predator. Axiom 2. Empire is a predator.
This axiom addresses the biological necessity of the system. A complex system, especially one as massive as a hegemonic empire, cannot survive solely on the energy it produces internally.
Its metabolic rate is simply too high.
Right. To maintain its structure, to keep the military funded and the standard of living artificially elevated for its citizens, it requires a constant, massive net inflow of foreign energy.
And by energy, again, we aren't just talking about barrels of crude oil.
We are talking about everything that constitutes systemic fuel. Capital, via the forced dollar demand we discussed. Goods, via the massive trade deficits. And intellectual horsepower, via immigrant talent.
It's constantly feeding.
The text makes a brutal biological point here. A self-sufficient empire is an oxymoron. It is a mathematical contradiction in terms.
Because if it were self-sufficient, it would just be a nation-state.
Precisely. For an empire, isolationism isn't just an unpopular political stance or, a bad economic policy. It is biological suicide.
If you cut off the external food supply, the symbiote will immediately begin to starve.
and it will metabolize its own organs. It must perpetually feed on the outside world to sustain its internal complexity.
Which brings us to the third axiom, and I think this is going to be incredibly jarring for anyone who still believes in the intrinsic value of money. Axiom 3. Currency is backed by violence.
Yes.
We all know fiat currency isn't backed by gold anymore, but we are so used to the polite fiction that it is backed by the full faith and credit of the government. What does the source material actually mean by this?
The author essentially dismisses full faith and credit as a bedtime story, a myth we tell citizens so they don't panic. The argument is that fiat currency, divorced from any tangible commodity, relies entirely on the threat of kinetic force to maintain its scarcity and its demand.
We mentioned earlier that fiat is backed by the military, but the source goes further, right? Framing it as a strict thermodynamic cost.
Yes, this isn't just a metaphor for intimidation, it is an energy equation. The United States dollar isn't valuable because the U.S. economy produces nice software or popular movies.
It's valuable because of the structural agreements.
Like the petrodollar. And because any historical attempt by a sovereign actor to bypass that system, to price essential global commodities in a non-dollar currency, has triggered a massive, violent immunological response from the system.
You look back at the Middle East over the last 30 years, and you trace the lines of nations that attempted to move away from dollar-denominated oil, the correlation is stark.
The text argues that the full faith and credit is merely a polite diplomatic euphemism for the operational range and lethality of American carrier strike groups.
Wow.
The carriers are literally the continuous energy expenditure required to maintain the artificial gravity well of the dollar. Without the implicit threat of violence, the force demand evaporates. The currency devalues to reflect its actual production base, and the extraction engine halts.
So if we synthesize these three axioms, we see this vicious, perfectly calibrated flywheel. The dollar's reserve status mathematically permits the U.S. to run infinite deficits. Those deficits are used to fund a colossal, technologically unparalleled military. That military is then deployed globally to secure the physical raw materials and enforce the invisible rules that keep the world locked into using the dollar as the reserve currency.
Which, in turn, allows for even larger deficits, which funds an even larger military. It is a closed-loop mechanism for global extraction that is elegantly simple in its design, but infinitely complex in its execution.
It's a flawless machine on paper.
Yeah.
But here's where we have to pause. Because if I look at the actual physical reality of the United States right now, this perfect flywheel theory hits a brick wall.
It does seem to contradict the theory at first glance.
Right. If this machine is so exquisitely engineered, why is the country tearing itself apart from the inside? You look at domestic politics, the polarization, the screaming matches over immigration and borders and national identity. It doesn't look like a well-oiled machine humming along.
No, it looks chaotic.
It looks like a system having a violent terminal breakdown. If the empire absolutely requires this constant inflow of foreign talent and cheap labor to survive, why is the domestic population in a state of open, furious revolt against it?
That is the pivotal contradiction, and it's where the source introduces one of its most profound models. It doesn't view this internal political chaos as a bug or, a temporary cultural shift. It diagnoses it as systemic waste heat.
Systemic waste heat.
Yes, it uses a biological framework, arguing that the United States is suffering from a terminal autoimmune disorder, a literal war between the symbiote and the host.
The symbiote being the empire and the host being the nation state. Let's use a visceral analogy here. It feels like we are talking about a tapeworm and a human host.
That is an incredibly apt, if unsettling, way to visualize it. Let's map that analogy to the source's framework. The tapeworm represents the imperial logic of the system.
Okay.
This is the coalition of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the Pentagon, the elite academic institutions. This faction understands the thermodynamic math of the empire perfectly.
Right. The tapeworm knows it has a massive metabolic requirement.
Yeah.
It knows that to maintain the stock market, to design the next generation of AI and hypersonic missiles, it must continuously suck in the absolute best cognitive talent from around the world.
And it knows that to keep the internal service economy from collapsing under the weight of inflation, it needs a massive influx of low-skilled, low-wage labor.
Exactly. To the tapeworm, to the imperial brain, immigration is not a sentimental issue about diversity or cultural exchange. It is a strict mathematical, logistical requirement for survival.
It is the fuel necessary to keep the flywheel spinning. They look at borders as an annoying friction that slows down the ingestion of necessary nutrients.
But then you have the host body.
Yes.
Yeah.
The host represents the human, biological, tribal software of the everyday citizens. The people living in the provincial towns, attending the local schools, working the domestic jobs.
And the host's biological imperative has absolutely nothing to do with global empire or thermodynamic hegemony.
Not at all.
The host's imperative is local.
Their imperative is tribal identity, cultural cohesion, institutional trust, and localized economic security. They operate on biological software optimized for a cohesive nation-state, not a sprawling, extractive global empire.
So when the tapeworm opens the floodgates to suck in millions of foreign laborers and global elite talent to feed its metabolic needs,
The host body's immune system detects it. The host doesn't experience this massive influx as vital economic growth or GDP expansion.
the biological software interprets it as a massive foreign invasion.
It recognizes foreign cells entering the bloodstream, and it does exactly what an immune system is designed to do. It mounts a violent, inflammatory response.
It induces a fever. The political polarization, the rise of intense nationalism, the demands for closed borders and protectionism. This isn't just a political disagreement over tax policy.
No.
The source is arguing that this is the host's biological immune system literally trying to kill the tapeworm.
The host body is screaming, "We're being invaded!" And it attacks, desperately trying to purge the foreign elements to save the integrity of the nation-state. What the host doesn't realize is that the tapeworm has completely hijacked the vital organs.
Because if the host successfully closes the borders, if it stops the inflow of foreign talent and labor, it starves the tapeworm.
And if the tapeworm starves, the imperial engine stops. The dollar collapses, the deficits implode, and the standard of living for the host completely evaporates.
That is the terminal nature of the disorder. You cannot solve this by voting for a different politician.
The logic of an empire, which must be expansionist, cosmopolitan, fluid, and extractive, and the logic of a nation-state, which must be cohesive, bordered, stable, and homogeneous. They are mutually exclusive over a long enough timeline.
They just can't coexist indefinitely.
The system is thrashing because it is attempting to be both simultaneously, and the cognitive dissonance is physically tearing the structure apart.
The tapeworm is desperately trying to feed so the organism can live another day, while the host is trying to violently vomit up the very nutrients keeping it alive. That is an incredibly grim diagnosis.
It's a fatal paradox.
So if this organism is thrashing, if the internal waste heat is building up to a critical level, how does the system actually end? What is the kill shot? Because a system this heavily armed isn't going to be conquered by an external military force.
No, the military engine is far too robust for a kinetic defeat. The text identifies the single fatal vulnerability of the entire system as entirely financial.
The currency.
The kill shot is the loss of the dollar's reserve status, the removal of the first cylinder.
The moment the world finds a way to stop paying tribute.
Exactly. The source points heavily toward coalitions like BRICS, plus Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding allies. We often dismiss them because their internal politics are messy and their economies are vastly different.
Right, people say they can never agree on anything.
But the text argues we are missing the mechanical point. They don't need to love each other. They only need to agree on one specific mechanical hack, creating a viable, non-dollar mechanism for trading essential commodities.
How does that actually work in practice? We were talking about bilateral currency swaps, right? Or pricing oil directly in gold, or maybe rolling out a central bank digital currency ledger that just bypasses the SWIFT system entirely.
Yes, all of the above. If these nations, which control a massive percentage of the world's actual physical commodities and human labor, successfully establish a trusted ledger that doesn't require conversion into US dollars, the artificial forced demand for the dollar evaporates overnight.
And if that synthetic demand evaporates, the United States can no longer export its inflation. The trillions of dollars held in foreign central bank vaults come rushing back home.
The currency violently devalues to match the actual domestic industrial output.
Which means the U.S. can no longer run those massive deficits.
And without the deficits, it can no longer afford the thermodynamic cost of the carrier strike groups.
Wow.
The military engine loses its fuel source, the enforcement arm vanishes, the planetary headhunter shuts down, the flywheel violently seizes.
We are essentially observing the terminal phase of this hegemonic symbiote, a dying behemoth trapped in a fatal paradox between its strict thermodynamic need to feed on the world and its host's biological instinct to purge the food. It is a mesmerizing, if absolutely terrifying way to map the current geopolitical reality.
It strips away all the comforting illusions we cling to about global politics, but it is vital to remember that this entire macro system is only the first layer of the source material.
Right, there's more.
It only explains how wealth and power are extracted at the state level. The text then zooms in, taking us down to the microscopic level of human biology to explain how that extracted wealth is distributed internally.
And this is where the deep dive takes a turn from geopolitical theory into something far more visceral. Because if you have this massive global machine designed specifically to extract and hoard resources at the top, a logical question arises. Why hasn't it permanently locked up the board?
Why aren't we all just serfs?
Exactly. Why aren't we just living in a static medieval world where 10 immortal kings own the entire planet and the rest of us are peasants? The source points to a mechanism that honestly sent a chill down my spine. The great equalizer of human history isn't democracy. It isn't taxation. It is human biology.
It is the biological algorithm of wealth, the death reset.
Let's unpack this biological failsafe.
Yeah.
To do that accurately, we first have to agree on what wealth actually is. Because in popular culture, wealth is a very fuzzy concept.
It is. We think of it as status or luxury.
Right. It's an abstract number on a banking app, or it's associated with luxury goods. How do these sources rigorously define wealth?
The source material is mathematically strict here. Wealth is not a feeling. It is not an abstract concept. It is a psychological ledger. It is a mass consensus system that functions as a claim check on finite, tangible, physical reality.
A claim check on the physical world. Let's make that concrete for the listener.
Think about the actual physical constraints of the planet. There is a finite amount of arable topsoil. There is a finite volume of fresh water. There is a finite number of joules of energy that can be generated by our grids, a finite amount of steel, concrete, and human labor hours available in any given year.
So real things, things you can touch.
Yes. If you are considered wealthy in this system, it means you possess a disproportionately massive stack of claim checks for those physical resources.
But the claim checks themselves are an illusion.
Entirely. You cannot eat a stock certificate.
Yes.
$1 billion digital dollars on a bank server cannot shield you from the rain. Your wealth relies absolutely and entirely on the rest of society collectively hallucinating that your digital ledger entry gives you the sovereign right to command the physical resources you need.
It is a fragile psychological consensus.
Very fragile.
Okay, so wealth is a socially agreed upon claim on finite reality. Once you understand that, the text introduces a hypothetical scenario that outlines the true danger of capitalism. It's called the immortality problem, or the null hypothesis. It asks a simple question. What happens to this psychological ledger if human beings stop dying?
If you remove biological mortality from the equation of capitalism, you instantly expose the absolute mathematical terror of compound interest.
Walk me through the math of that terror. We all know compound interest is powerful, but why is it mathematically fatal to a society without death?
Because of the variables in the formula. Everyone focuses on the interest rate, but the dominant God-tier variable in compounding is time. Given an unlimited timeline, any initial advantage in resource accumulation, no matter how microscopic, inevitably trends toward infinity.
So imagine a society where people are biologically immortal. The early accumulators, the people who grabbed the first pieces of land or built the first factories, they get a slight head start.
And because they never die, they never stop compounding. They use the profits from the first factory to buy the second, then the fourth, then the eighth.
Just snowballing forever.
Because the real-world physical resources, the land, the water, the energy, are strictly finite. As the early accumulators' abstract wealth mathematically approaches infinity, their claim on those finite resources approaches 100%.
They would literally own the entire physical earth. Every square foot of dirt, every drop of water.
We would be instantly locked into a permanent, completely static, two-class system. You would have a microscopic fraction of immortal god kings who hold 100% of the claim checks on reality.
And everyone else?
Beneath them, billions of permanent biological serfs with an absolute 0% chance of upward mobility. No new genius could invent a new technology to unseat them. No new entrepreneur could outcompete them because the immortal god kings would simply buy the new invention or the new competitor the exact millisecond it appeared on the board. The game would be permanently, irrevocably locked.
It is the ultimate dystopian nightmare. It is a flawless, inescapable mathematical cage. Which leads us to the grim realization. The only thing, literally the only thing saving humanity from permanent absolute feudalism is the grave.
According to the strict mechanical logic of this systemic model, yes. Death is not a tragedy. It is the vital biological failsafe against permanent oligarchy. It is referred to in the text as the mortality event.
And this mortality event triggers what the authors call the fracturing process. This is where the source absolutely demolishes our deeply held, feel-good beliefs about human progress.
It really takes a sledgehammer to them.
We like to think that society improves because people become more enlightened or because the wealthy engage in philanthropy. What actually happens mechanically when an apex accumulator hits their mortality event?
The text models biological death as a stochastic, randomized reset button that hits the system at unpredictable intervals. When the apex accumulator dies, their monolithic, terrifying horde of claim checks is subjected to the fracturing process. A single, infinitely powerful vector of capital is forcibly broken apart and scattered.
It doesn't just transition neatly to a single heir who continues the compounding.
Very rarely. In the wild, it is fractured by the division of inheritance among multiple children, who then divide it among their children. It is bled heavily by estate taxes, assuming the state is powerful enough to enforce them.
And lawyers, don't forget the lawyers.
Exactly. It is paralyzed and drained by massive, protracted legal battles between heirs. And perhaps most reliably, it is rapidly squandered by second and third generations who inherited the wealth but possess absolutely zero of the predatory accumulation skills of the original founder.
It's the mechanism behind that old proverb, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The concentration of power is forcibly diluted by the biological incompetence of the offspring.
Exactly. The grip slackens. And this brings us to one of the most intellectually brutal insights of the entire source text.
I'm bracing myself. Let's hear it.
The text mathematically argues that human progress, macro-social mobility, and the general improvement in the standard of living for the working class are absolutely fundamentally not the result of elite benevolence, charity, or trickle-down economics.
It's not because the billionaire had a change of heart and decided to build a library or raise wages.
Not at all. Progress is the strict, unavoidable biological byproduct of systemic churn. The wealthy do not willingly share their hoard. Their physical grip on the claim checks simply rots away when their biological heart stops beating.
So the improvement in your life as an average citizen is nothing more than the opportunity generated by the scramble for what falls off the table when the accumulator's estate is violently fractured.
Progress is just the vacuum created by death.
It's like an ancient, massive canopy tree in a rainforest. While it's alive, it monopolizes 100% of the sunlight and 100% of the water, and nothing beneath it can grow. The saplings are just starved.
A perfect ecological analogy.
But when lightning strikes it, or rot finally brings it down, it crashes to the forest floor, ripping a hole in the canopy. And in that sudden burst of sunlight, 1,000 new plants violently compete for the newly available energy.
That is the perfect biological translation of the fracturing process. Death forces the system to reset, preventing the canopy from permanently sealing off the light.
But wait, if I process this, if biological death is the only reset button preventing us from sliding into the null hypothesis of permanent feudalism, I have to ask a genuinely chilling question. What happens to this entire global ecosystem if the apex accumulators figure out how to unplug the reset button?
That is the exact klaxon the source text is sounding. We are currently witnessing a deliberate, incredibly well-funded systemic hack of the fracturing process. The reset button is being dismantled.
How? I mean, they haven't cured death. The billionaires are still biologically mortal. They still get old. Their organs still fail.
Yes, but the text argues they have realized a terrifying loophole. They don't need to cure biological death if they can achieve legal and financial immortality. The apex accumulators are actively attacking the reset button on 2 distinct fronts.
What's the first front?
The first front is biological life extension.
You mean the billions pouring into biotech, stem cells, and anti-aging research?
Exactly. If you can stretch the human lifespan from an average of 80 years to 120 or 150 years, you dramatically manipulate the time variable in the compound interest formula we discussed earlier.
Because they keep compounding?
You stretch the compounding curve further into the exponential phase, delaying the reset button long enough to capture a vastly larger percentage of the finite resources.
But even at 150 years, the biology eventually fails. The tree eventually falls.
Which is why the second front, the legal architecture, is so catastrophic to the system. They are utilizing dynastic trusts, multi-generational offshore shell companies, and incredibly intricate tax engineering to sever the wealth entirely from the human lifespan.
Wait, I'm doing the math in my head here. If someone creates a dynastic trust, they essentially take their hoard of claim checks and transfer it into a legal fiction, a legal entity that does not have a biological heartbeat.
Precisely. They create a corporate vault that is legally immortal. The human meat body of the founder might expire, but the wealth does not go through the fracturing process.
So it doesn't get divided.
It doesn't get divided, it doesn't get taxed, it doesn't get squandered by the heirs. It remains perfectly intact, continuing to compound infinitely, managed by an army of algorithms and institutional fiduciaries whose sole legal mandate is to maximize the hoard.
So the wealth continues to act as if the original apex predator were still alive, compounding forever. The human dies, but the capital achieves immortality.
Exactly. The source warns that we are literally watching the death reset code being systematically deleted from our societal operating system.
And if that code is deleted, the failsafe is gone, which means we begin a rapid, mathematically unavoidable slide right back into the null hypothesis.
We are being dragged backward toward the immortality scenario. But it won't look like medieval kings in stone castles wielding swords. It will be a sterile, highly modernized form of digital, legal feudalism.
What does that look like day to day?
A world where a handful of legally immoral, faceless trusts own 99% of the real-world resources, the land, the water, the automated means of production. And the rest of humanity is born into a system where they must simply rent the right to biologically exist from these immortal entities.
Okay, let me just try to process the sheer weight of what we've mapped out so far. We have a global hegemonic empire extracting resources via a thermodynamic military economic engine. Inside that empire, the ultra-rich are successfully severing their wealth from biological mortality, bypassing the only mechanism designed to distribute that wealth back into the system.
That's the state of the board, yes.
So we arrive at the critical third pillar. If they are hoarding all this immortal capital, what are they actually doing with it?
That is the $1 million question.
Because if you turn on CNBC or read a Forbes editorial, the defense of this extreme wealth concentration is always identical. The narrative is, stop demonizing billionaires. They aren't villains sitting in a dark basement hoarding gold coins like a dragon. They are putting that capital to work. They are the job creators. They are building factories. They are innovating technology. They are pushing humanity forward.
And that deeply ingrained defense mechanism is the precise target of the final section of our source text. The authors completely meticulously dismantle that narrative. They refer to it as a 19th century industrialist fantasy.
So the idea that concentrated wealth builds a better society is a lie.
The text argues it is actually worse than a lie. It is a foundational teleological fallacy. It relies on a complete misunderstanding of what capital is. The defenders of billionaires confuse the process of building with the purpose of the capital.
Unpack that teleological fallacy for me. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means we falsely assign human virtues to an inhuman system. The text argues that capital with a capital C must be understood as an autonomous, amoral telos. It operates exactly like a biological virus.
A virus. Let's explore that metaphor.
What is a virus? A virus has no morality, it doesn't hate you, it doesn't want to make you healthy, and it doesn't even necessarily want to kill you, because a dead host is a useless host.
It just wants to spread.
A virus possesses exactly one non-negotiable prime directive coded into its RNA: replicate, maximize its own numbers by any means necessary. The text argues that capital operates on the exact same algorithmic directive. Its singular, unyielding goal is self-propagation. It exists only to maximize W, where W equals the total mass of wealth.
So it has no allegiance to human flourishing? It does not inherently seek social utility?
Zero. It does not care about creating jobs or building communities or curing diseases.
But we can't deny reality. Billionaires do create jobs. They do build massive logistics networks and automated factories.
Yes, but they only execute those actions when building a factory happens to be the most mathematically efficient pathway to maximize W in that specific moment. Building is never the end goal of capital. It is merely a temporary disposable tool used to achieve replication.
Okay, I see.
And to prove this, the source explicitly maps out how modern capital actually flows today. It outlines 5 specific pathways, what it calls the 5 great diversions, or siphons. We need to meticulously walk through all 5, because if you understand these siphons, you understand exactly why the modern economy feels so hollowed out.
Let's follow the money, because this capital isn't going into building bridges or funding a new renaissance. Where's the first place it flows?
Siphon 1 is financialization. The benevolent builder narrative assumes that when a billionaire realizes $1 billion in profit, they use it to build a new research lab or start a new company. The statistical reality is that trillions of dollars of accumulated capital are simply pumped back into existing financial assets: stocks, bonds, derivatives, exotic synthetic instruments.
It's casino economics. It's a closed loop.
Exactly. They are deploying massive amounts of capital to simply bid up the price of things that already exist. If a hedge fund buys 1 million shares of an existing tech monopoly, they haven't built a single new warehouse. They haven't invented a new microchip. They haven't hired a single new worker.
You just made the stock more expensive.
They have just mathematically enriched the people who already own the asset. The capital generates absolute zero intangible, real-world products or social utility. It is entirely parasitic to the real economy.
Which naturally leads us to the second siphon, which I think is one of the most egregious hacks of the modern corporate system.
Siphon 2. Stock buybacks. This is the ultimate proof that the building narrative is a myth. Imagine a massive multinational corporation that has a record-breaking year, billions in pure profit. The builder mythology dictates they will use that war chest to expand operations or lower prices for consumers or significantly increase wages for the workers who generated the profit.
But instead, they deploy financial engineering.
Instead, the executives use the corporation's own treasury cash to go into the open market and buy its own stock back from public shareholders.
I want to break down the math of why this is so toxic. By buying the stock and retiring it, they artificially reduce the total number of shares in existence. So even if the company's actual real-world value hasn't grown by a single penny, the earnings per share, the profit divided by the newly shrunken number of shares, instantly inflates.
Which automatically drives the stock price up.
And who benefits from that?
The C-suite executives, whose multi-million-dollar compensation packages are tied directly to the stock price hitting certain targets. They use the company's own blood supply to artificially inflate the stock, triggering massive personal bonuses, while completely gutting the corporate treasury of the capital that could have been used to innovate or protect the company in a downturn.
They are literally cannibalizing the internal organs of the business to maximize short-term W for the apex accumulators. It is the exact mathematical opposite of building.
It's strip mining from the inside out. Okay, but let's say they've inflated the stock, they've taken their massive bonuses. That capital is now liquid. Because they have this immense dollar dominance, they are forced to find a place to park it that yields a safe return. Which brings us to the commodification of biological survival, Siphon 3.
Siphon 3. Speculative real estate. Capital is algorithmic. It constantly searches for the most inelastic demand curve it can exploit. And there is nothing more inelastic than the human biological need for shelter. So massive pools of immortal capital private equity firms, sovereign wealth funds, flow into real estate.
But again, they aren't using this capital to build 3 million new affordable starter homes to solve the housing crisis.
No, because building new supply would lower prices, which damages W. Instead, the capital flows into aggressively buying up existing single-family homes and massive apartment complexes, packaging them into Wall Street portfolios.
They are treating physical human shelter the exact same way they treat a Bitcoin or a tech stock.
Precisely. They have transformed a fundamental requirement for biological survival into a speculative financial asset. By hoarding the available supply, they artificially constrain the market, driving the underlying asset prices and the rental yields into the stratosphere.
They act as a toll booth on human survival. That is a brutally accurate way to describe it. If you want to not freeze to death on the street, you have to pay a massive percentage of your labor directly to an immortal trust that simply bought the deed to your shelter. Again, no new value is created. Wealth is simply extracted from the working class and transferred to the apex accumulators.
It is pure rent-seeking. But what happens when they actually do invest in technology? What happens when capital flows into venture capital in Silicon Valley? The defense is always, look at the tech sector, we are funding the future. That brings us to Siphon 4.
Siphon 4, the efficiency parasite. This addresses the job creator lie directly. Where is the apex capital actually going right now? It is flooding by the hundreds of billions into software, automation, and artificial intelligence.
And we must ask why. The defenders point out that tech companies hire people. And they do. They hire a microscopic handful of hyper-elite, vastly overcompensated engineers. But what is the actual teleological purpose of the systems those engineers are building?
The explicit purpose of enterprise AI and advanced automation is to eliminate the need for thousands of regular middle-class workers.
Exactly. We are in a mature, globally saturated market. Consumer growth is heavily capped. If a corporation cannot double its revenue by finding new customers, the amoral algorithm dictates there is only one other way to maximize W, mercilessly crush operational costs.
Yeah.
The denominator effect. The explicit goal of this massive capital investment in AI is to permanently destroy labor costs.
It mathematically proves that in the eyes of the capital algorithm, hiring a human being providing a job is never a virtue to be celebrated. It is an annoying, bleeding cost that must be aggressively identified and eliminated. The capital isn't funding AI to elevate humanity, it's funding AI to amputate the human workforce from the balance sheet.
Which leaves us with the final destination. Once the capital has financialized the stock market, cannibalized the corporations, monopolized housing, and automated away the labor, what does it do with the leftover trillions? Siphon 5.
Siphon 5, the dead money lake. This addresses the final defense, where people say, well, eventually they run out of things to buy, so the money just sits in a bank, which lets the bank lend it out to normal people. But that's not what happens, is it?
No. The apex accumulators do not leave trillions in standard savings accounts. They park the excess in what the source calls the dead money lake. This is the hoarding of ultra-luxury, completely non-productive assets. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars locked up in fine art, stored in tax-free free ports in Geneva. We are talking about massive allocations into negative-yielding sovereign bonds.
Assets that do absolutely nothing.
They're designed entirely to act as a cryogenic freezer for wealth. Their only function is to preserve the accumulator's position on the global psychological ledger against inflation, while taking absolutely zero real-world risks. It is the highly sophisticated, digitized equivalent of a dragon burying gold in a cave. It sits there, functionally dead to the real economy, completely removed from any productive velocity.
Okay, I hear you. The 5 siphons paint an incredibly damning picture. Financialization, stock buybacks, real estate speculation, labor-crushing AI, and dead money hoarding.
It's bleak.
But I have to push back here because I want to stress test this amoral calculus. Let's look at the psychology of the people running this capital. Surely, if I am a billionaire CEO or a hedge fund manager, my ego alone dictates that I want to build things. I want my name on a gleaming new factory. I want the cover of Forbes praising me as an innovator. Fundamentally, building a new, highly profitable enterprise must be preferred over destroying an existing one, right? Why would the system actively reward destruction?
You are making the classic diagnostic error. You are still trying to project human psychology, human ego, and human morality onto the algorithm. The source lays out exactly how capital makes decisions. It introduces the decision rule of capital, which we can conceptualize as the algorithm of profitable churn.
Profitable churn. Let's run the algorithm. Walk me through exactly how it calculates creation versus destruction.
Imagine you are the fiduciary of a massive pool of immortal capital, and you are evaluating a mid-sized, stable manufacturing company. The algorithm presents you with an action menu. Action A is build. You invest massive capital into R&D, you hire new scientists, you spend years inventing a revolutionary new product. It takes a decade, it involves massive risk of failure, but if it works, it might yield a steady 10% annual return.
Sounds traditional.
Action B is maintain. You keep the company running exactly as it is, you pay the workers fairly, you maintain the equipment, you accept a safe, boring 5% return.
Okay.
And then there is Action C, strip and destroy.
How does strip and destroy possibly make more money than inventing a new product?
We must look at the mechanics of the private equity model. The source uses the leveraged buyout, the LBO, as the ultimate proof of the algorithm's destructive preference. Let's take a hypothetical target, Acme Corp. It's a stable company, zero debt, happy workers, steady profits. The private equity firm decides to execute Action C. They buy Acme Corp, but they don't use their own capital.
Right, they use borrowed money, but how does that work? If I want to buy a house, the bank puts the mortgage on me.
Not in an LBO. Through aggressive financial engineering, the private equity firm secures a massive loan from a consortium of banks, and they legally attach that debt directly to the balance sheet of Acme Corp itself. They force the target to borrow the money required for its own acquisition.
That is insane. It's like forcing someone to dig their own grave and then charging them for the shovel. Acme Corp is now instantly saddled with hundreds of millions in high-interest debt that it never asked for.
Exactly. Now that Acme Corp is heavily leveraged, the private equity firm executes the extraction phase of Action C. They fire the entire R&D department because R&D takes years to pay off. They lay off 25% of the workforce to instantly crush operational costs. They sell the physical real estate the factory sits on to a third party and force Acme Corp to rent it back, turning a hard asset into immediate cash.
And what do they do with all that cash they just generated from gutting the company?
They issue what is called a special dividend. They take all the cash generated from the layoffs and the real estate sales, and they pay it directly to themselves, the private equity firm. They recoup their entire initial investment plus a massive profit in a matter of months.
And what happens to Acme Corp?
Acme Corp is now a hollowed-out shell. It's carrying massive debt, it has no R&D, it has a demoralized skeleton crew workforce, and it has to pay rent on a building it used to own. When the next mild economic downturn hits, Acme Corp cannot service the debt. It defaults. It files for bankruptcy.
And the workers.
The workers lose their jobs. The local community loses a tax base. The suppliers go out of business. The pension fund gets wiped out in bankruptcy court. Total systemic destruction of the host.
But the private equity firm?
The private equity firm already took their money out via the special dividend 2 years ago. They walk away with a 400% return on their investment in an incredibly short time frame. They suffer zero consequences from the bankruptcy.
That is horrifying, and it is completely legal.
It is not only legal, it is mathematically worshipped by the system. The oracle of profit dictates that action C, strict and destroy yielded a vastly higher, infinitely faster return on investment with lower personal risk than action A or action B.
So the destruction of Acme Corp, the destruction of all those livelihoods, wasn't an unfortunate accident or a market failure. It was the intended output. It was the product.
Exactly. Which brings us to the profound ultimate conclusion of this section, the instrumentalization of process. The text argues that in the cold, unblinking eyes of capital, creation and destruction are not moral opposites. They're not good and evil. They are completely neutral, purely interchangeable tools in the toolbox of capital expansion.
A hammer can be used to build a hospital, or it can be used to cave in a human skull. The hammer has no morality. It doesn't care. It only transfers force.
Precisely. If building a hospital expands the wealth parameter W faster, the algorithm will build a hospital. If liquidating the hospital, firing the nurses, and selling the land to a luxury condo developer expands W faster, it will destroy the hospital without a microsecond of hesitation.
The rich individuals orchestrating these moves, the hedge fund managers, the PE executives, they aren't necessarily evil supervillains rubbing their hands together, plotting the downfall of humanity. They are merely the human processors running the most ruthless, optimized version of this amoral code. Because if they experience a sudden pang of conscience, if they refuse to execute Action C on Acme Corp, they will be fired. A competitor will run the exact same math, buy the company, and execute the destruction anyway, replacing them at the top of the hierarchy.
They're completely captured by the logic of the system they think they control.
They are the most devoted, helpless servants of the virus.
Okay, we need to take a massive step back and try to synthesize the absolute gauntlet we just ran through, because the scale of this analysis is staggering.
It really is a lot to take in.
We started at the planetary level. We mapped out a global hegemonic symbiote, an American empire running purely on the thermodynamic physics of power. A two-cylinder engine utilizing the forced synthetic demand of the dollar, backed by the kinetic violence of carrier strike groups, to mathematically require a constant, predatory ingestion of foreign talent and wealth.
And we saw how that metabolic requirement triggers a violent, autoimmune political fever in the host nation, the thrashing of the symbiote.
Yes. For there, we zoomed down into the internal distribution of that extracted wealth. We exposed the biological algorithm of wealth, realizing that human mortality, the chaotic, unpredictable reset button of death, is the only fail-safe preventing an absolute, mathematically guaranteed descent into permanent oligarchy. And we documented how the apex accumulators are currently using life extension and immortal legal trusts to systematically delete that reset code.
The terrifying march toward digital legal feudalism.
And finally, we dismantled the most pervasive economic myth of our time, the benevolent builder. We exposed the 5 siphons of modern wealth, proving that the amoral algorithm of capital views the creation of a thriving business and the predatory strip mining of a community with the exact same robotic, sociopathic enthusiasm, deciding which to execute based purely on the velocity of the return on investment.
I am well aware that to you, the listener, this synthesis might sound incredibly bleak. It borders on nihilism. But I want to offer a final, crucial perspective on why this specific source material is so invaluable. Understanding these brutal mechanics is not an invitation to despair. It is an invitation to absolute clarity.
Clarity over comfort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you internalize the thermodynamics of imperial power, the biological failsafe of wealth, and the amoral telos of capital, you stop being confused by the world. You stop watching the news and wondering why politicians act in ways that seem socially insane, or why corporations make decisions that actively harm their consumers. You stop being distracted by the moralizing puppet show of daily partisan politics.
You see the mechanics.
You finally start seeing the strings. You begin to understand the actual physical mechanics of the matrix you inhabit. And that cold clinical understanding is the first absolute prerequisite to surviving it and perhaps eventually altering it.
Seeing the strings. I love that framing. And it leads me to one final, incredibly provocative thought that I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over on your own time. We've spent this entire deep dive connecting the systems. We've mapped how the imperial tapeworm feeds on the globe. We've mapped how the apex wealth consolidates into immortal legal vaults. And we've proved that the capital algorithm will ruthlessly strip a stable company for parts if the math dictates it's the most profitable move.
Right.
So let's connect the final dots. Based on every mechanical law we just unpacked, if capital has absolutely no loyalty to the human process of building, if it possesses no soul and no morality, and if the ultimate biological reset button of death is successfully being bypassed by the ultra-wealthy, what happens when that amoral capital algorithm eventually calculates that the most profitable action isn't just to strip a single company for parts, but to strip the nation-state itself?
That is the ultimate, terrifying, logical conclusion of the equation.
Think back to the X-ray analogy. We thought we were just looking for a broken bone in the economy. But the X-ray reveals that the system's own immune response is shutting down the vital organs to feed a terminal tumor. What happens to the host body when the symbiote decides it has consumed everything of value and it's time to cash out?
The ultimate profitable churn, the liquidation of the empire itself.
A thermodynamic inevitability to keep you up at night. Thank you all so much for joining us on this incredibly intense, paradigm-shifting journey today. Remember to always question the narratives you are handed, aggressively look for the underlying mechanics of power, and always stay insanely curious. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.